Hello everybody, this is Grandmaster Robert Hungaski for chesslecture.com, and today I wanted to share with you a game that I played this past weekend in an online tournament. It was a French defense Winawer variation, and where my opponent chose one of White's most interesting sidelines. But before I show you my own game, I wanted to show you a game that was played a long time ago in that same variation that made a strong impression on me. And it was one of the main reasons why I actually adopted this system as White, and it was one of the first systems that I started to investigate when I adopted the French defense as Black, because I felt like it was an underrated weapon and one that avoided the kind of positions that Black is looking for. So let's jump right in and look at this stem game from White's perspective and then see how we can pinpoint where Black went wrong, and then turn to my game and see how I attempted to improve on Nimzowicz's play. So after the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, e5, c5, and now the key move here, bishop d2. Now, this is a very clever move because the whole point of the Winawer variation is to create, well, let's say after the main move, some very serious pawn weaknesses for White on the queen side, particularly the doubled pawns on c2 and c3. This is a long-term problem for White, and one that creates positions that are very difficult to understand, and I would say, even though somewhat delicate for Black, much harder to play for White. So the point of bishop to d2 is simply to defend the knight on c3 and be able to meet the move bishop takes c3 with bishop takes c3, thus getting the bishop pair without having to make any structural concessions. So here Black needs to be very careful, because a natural move like c takes d4 would already be a serious mistake, since White would play knight b5. So here we see the other important idea behind bishop to d2. White isn't just defending the knight, but is also preparing this powerful piece trade, because trading off the dark squared bishops would be a huge accomplishment for White. For example, after bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, not only will White recover the d4 pawn sooner or later by playing moves like f4, knight f3, knight takes d4, but now also the move knight d6 becomes a serious problem, and it's actually not possible for Black to stop it. So in the game, Black played the move knight e7. This is also the move that I played, and I think it's the best move. So that after knight b5, bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, Black can castle just in time so that knight d6 won't come with check. Now, I think this is the critical position of the bishop d2 variation, and White has quite a few options here. White has the positional option, which was played in this game, which is pawn to c3, arguing that White has a favorable version of the advanced variation, right? Because in the advanced variation, usually the dark square bishops would still be on the board, and this trade clearly favors White, who is now putting all of his pawns, or as many of his pawns, on dark squares as he possibly can. And should White be able to complete his development, let's say by playing moves like f4, knight f3, bishop d3, and castle kingside, White will be clearly better. So this is a position that requires swift action on Black's part. The other moves here are f4. f4 is a much more aggressive option because it plans to sacrifice a pawn. How does White plan to sacrifice this pawn? Well, after the move c takes d4, knight f3, knight c6, for example, White could recapture on d4, but that's really not what the point of f4 is. Rather, White would like to play bishop to d3, and, for example, if a6, knight d6, and White will continue with moves like castles, queen e1, and queen h4. So the whole point of this variation is to create an attack on the king side and completely forget about this d4 pawn. And that d4 pawn is so weak that it will fall eventually. So that's not something that white needs to concern himself with, at least not immediately. So I would like to mention what I believe to be black's, or one of black's, most interesting ways of meeting this f4 idea. And that is, let's go back a couple of moves. After f4, the move a6. Forcing this knight to decide where it wants to go. Obviously, it will usually go to d6. And after the knight goes to d6, then cd4. Now, you might think, well, this doesn't really change anything because I will still go knight f3, bishop d3, and castles. And you actually forced me to go to d6 by playing a6, which white has no trouble with. But the key idea here is that black must put as much pressure on e5 as possible. And playing knight bc6 is not the most effective way of doing this, because then the knight on e7 doesn't really have a good way of contributing towards this pressure. So the move that I like is knight ec6, so that after bishop d3, now we can play f6, and after castles, we can go knight d7. And we see that both of black's knights, along with the pawn on f6, of course, are undermining white's control over e5. So here I think that black has more than enough counterplay. For example, if rook a to e1, which looks like the most natural move, already the tactics start to work in black's favor. For example, after f e5, knight d takes e5, white will have to take on c8, and after knight f3, rook f3, gf3, queen takes c8. Well, black is already much, much better here. Black is up material, has a better pawn structure, better king safety, probably a good knight against bad bishop situation might arise. So this is the idea. Later you can check it with the computer. You'll see that it all checks out. But I think this is a very thoughtful way of dealing with this f4 idea. The other option is to go d takes c5, trying to grab a pawn. And here, if you do a quick database search, you'll see that the overwhelming amount of games that feature this position also feature the move knight d7. Now, I think that black has a very interesting move here, which is b6, highlighting the fact that black has a lead in development, and after c takes b6, queen takes b6, white is going to have a little bit of trouble defending this pawn on b2. For example, already if, let's see, something like c3 perhaps, I think this is one of the main moves that I was looking at. If white plays f4, then you're just going to lose the b2 pawn. After something like bishop d7 and a6 is necessary, we're just going to take on b2. We'll get our pawn back, better pawn structure, lead in development, huge pressure on the queen side. Black's already better. So after c3, then simply knight d7, practically forcing f4, and then once again undermining this e5 pawn is the key idea. So after e takes f6, knight takes f6, already white should be very nervous about this position opening up. And for example, after bishop d3, knight e4, black is already in a lot of trouble. For example, bishop takes, pawn takes, knight d4. Here the move e3 is interesting. I mean, this was the first move I looked at, but the engine actually likes e5 even better, further opening the position after takes, knight g6. Now the knight is coming to e5 and d3 or c4. The f file has been opened up, so this king can no longer castle kingside. And yeah, black is just clearly better. So b6, to me, looks like a very strong move and certainly puts this dc5 move into question. Therefore, we're left with Alekhine's move, pawn to c3, which is also the move that was played against me. And here Nimzowitsch played the move b6, and this is not a move that I particularly like, because I think that across all the variations we've been discussing so far, the common denominator when black is successful is the undermining of the e5 pawn. And b6 really has nothing to do with that. So this game is a great example of what can happen if white is allowed to consolidate his structure, and in particular, his center. So now after f4, bishop a6, knight f3, queen d7, a4, and now after knight to c6, I really liked how pragmatic White was throughout this game. I mean, White could have made a lot of normal moves that most of us would make without even thinking about them, almost on autopilot. But the move f4 is mindful of the importance of the e5 pawn. So instead of playing knight f3 right away, White spends the time gaining that space. The same goes for the move a4, right? Instead of retreating the knight or placing the knight on d6, White continues to gain space to restrict Black's minor pieces. And here also, I mean, it would be very normal to play a move like bishop d3 in order to castle, but that might allow Black some counterplay based on knight a5. So White plays b4. More pawns on dark squares, more of Black's minor pieces being restricted. So after takes, bishop to b7, knight d6, and f5, once again, Black is looking to create avenues for his minor pieces. So if Black is allowed to play a5, then he will gain an outpost on b4 for the knight. Therefore, White plays another pragmatic move, pawn to a5. Now, Black's minor pieces on the queen side are pretty much dead in the water. And after knight c8, we see that Alekhine will now consolidate his clamp on the queen side with knight takes b7, queen takes, and a6, and will now target the loosely placed knights, particularly the one on c6, and will focus all of his attention on gaining control over the open c-file. So after bishop b5, knight to e7, castle kingside, h6, rook fc1, rook fc8, rook c2, queen e8, rook ac1, rook ab8. Here, the point of rook ab8 is that if we go rook c7 right away, White will simply play bishop to a4, and there's no good way of meeting b5 due to this pin. So by playing rook ab8 first, Black makes sure that bishop a4 can be met with b5. So White played queen e3, and now after rook to c7, we arrive at really an iconic moment of the history of chess strategy. Many have heard of the term Alekhine's gun, but few know why that term was coined, and it was actually because of this game. Here, Alekhine realized that the c-file was where it was at, but that for the moment he had hit a wall, that there was no good way of increasing the pressure on c6, because if White plays something like queen a3, rook c8, and now queen a4, this pressure is very strong, but it's still not devastating. And here White has reached sort of the peak of his pressure, and there's no good way of bringing this knight to also fight for the c6 square. So White must devise a way to increase the pressure on c6 without restricting this bishop, because White's winning maneuver is going to be based on the bishop retreat to a4 and then the advance of the pawn to b5. And the correct way of doing this is by placing the queen behind the rooks. So after rook c3, queen d7, rook 1 to c2, king f8, queen c1, now this knight on c6 becomes untenable for Black. The threat of bishop a4 followed by b5 is devastating. I mean, here we're threatening to take on c6, so we deflect the rook from b8, therefore renewing the idea of bishop a4, since now there's no more b5 to be concerned about. And this is just completely over, because the king does not manage to come and protect the c7 rook in time. So after bishop to a4, White is threatening b5. So Black had to sacrifice a pawn just to delay the move b5. And after bishop takes, king e8, bishop back to a4, king d8. So Black at least avoids losing the knight, since now b5 can be met with, let's say, knight a5 or knight b4. Now, still, that's probably winning for white, but I liked the way that Alekhine treated this position. In fact, it's very consistent with white's strategy all throughout this game. And it's finding the next move really depends on whether you're asking yourself the right question. And that question should always be, what is my opponent trying to do? Right? So if it was black's move, what would black play? And that is not an easy question to answer because black is completely tied down, and actually black is in Zugzwang. He cannot move either one of his knights, cannot move either one of his rooks, cannot move the queen because of the threat of b5, cannot move the king because of the threat of b5. So when your opponent is so tied down, you should be looking to increase the tension in the position, not resolve it, right? Not look for forcing moves like b5 that might allow your opponent to wiggle out of the clamp. So Alekhine played the move h4, and here black simply resigned. Again, he's just in Zugzwang. If something like g6, then white will play maybe king h1, and if h5, then why not simply king back to g1, and now black really has no more moves. So this is one of the all-time classics of chess strategy, one of the great games by Alekhine that was able to roll into a single game some key ideas like gaining space, like preventing your opponent's activation of his minor pieces, and also the fight for the open file and the introduction of this idea of Alekhine's gun. So let's go back and talk a little bit about this position, because Alekhine made a very strong case for this variation. After knight b5, takes, castles, and c3. How should black play then? Well, hopefully by now you will agree that being able to undermine this pawn on e5 has to be a central part of any successful strategy by black. So the move f6 is what I consider to be the best move. In my game, this was a blitz game, so it was a little fuzzy in my mind. I played the natural move knight bc6, and I think this is an okay move, but not nearly as accurate as f6. And now after pawn to f4, I'll just show how my game went as a point of reference. Then f6, knight f3, f takes e5, f takes e5, bishop d7, and now after castle kingside, a6, knight d6, cd4, cd4, queen b6, king b1, and knight c8. So this is the typical way that you get rid of that annoying knight on d6, and after knight takes c8, rook a takes c8. Here white would like to play bishop d3, but that's strongly met with the move knight b4. So my opponent developed the bishop to e2 first, and only after knight e7 did he go bishop d3. And here I tried to trade off the light squared bishops, as is normally the case. We've seen this idea a lot in the advanced variation. Queen goes to b6 to support this bishop trade. White refuses the trade, and now I look for the trade through this other avenue. But actually, my opponent missed that I had a dual intention in mind, because now, after the move knight g5, he missed that I was also threatening to play rook takes c2, after which he resigned. Because if king takes c2, bishop g6, king c1, rook c8 leads to checkmate or to the loss of white's queen. And of course, if queen takes c2, bishop g6, I mean, this is still what white should have played, because he can play rook d3. But here, after the move queen b5, rook h d1, black has a very nice tactic here, eliminating the key defender of d3, which is rook f1, threatening rook takes d1, followed by bishop takes d3. And if rook takes f1, bishop takes d3 wins the queen. So this was a nice little miniature that reinforces this idea that striking with f6 has to be a top priority for black. However, I don't think that including the move knight bc6 and white's knight to f3 is something that helps black in any way. So to finish off this idea, I would like to show the difference between playing f6 before knight bc6. So if white plays f4 now, we're going to see that after f takes e5, f takes e5, black has the move knight to f5. And this creates a very serious problem for white. First of all, we are controlling the d6 square, so we are going to play a6 and push this knight back to a bad square, mainly a3. But also, and perhaps most importantly, we are now introducing the threat of queen to h4, which would basically win on the spot. Therefore, by the way, here black can also include the move cd4, cd4, although this allows white the additional option of going knight c3, but it doesn't really make a difference. The knight on c3 is not going to change anything, because now after knight to f3, a6, and for example, if knight to c3, knight c6, we see that these knights are much more active than they were in any of the variations that we've already talked about, and black is already creating the tactical threat of knight takes d4 followed by queen h4, winning a very important central pawn. So here white would have to do something like castle queenside, and after bishop to d7, this is just a clearly better position for black. Black will play b5, b4, the rook might come to c8. The key point is that white can never play bishop to d3, because then after, for example, knight f takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes h7, you might say, oh, well, but here white gets the pawn back and white gets a good knight against bad bishop position. But this is not true, because after king takes h7, queen takes d4, black has queen g5. And actually, black's pawn center is much healthier than white's. This pawn on e5 is terribly weak. So for example, let's say after king to b1, already black can start maneuvering the bishop. For example, bishop to e8 is a typical maneuver in the French defense. This bishop is by no means worse than the knight on c3. Or black could also just bring the rook to c8 and play rook c4. In either case, black is clearly better. So this is the conclusion that I drew after I played my game and I did a little research on this variation. And I concluded that white after f6 cannot maintain this tension. He cannot reinforce the center with f4 and get a good position. Therefore, white would have to make some kind of strategic compromise here by playing e takes f6, and after rook takes f6, now something like knight f3, for example, avoiding any further neglect of the development. And after a6, of course, there's no more outpost on d6, so the knight will have to go to a3. And after cd4, cd4, knight b to c6, I think this is a typical French defense structure where black's backward pawn on e6 is easily offset by white's isolated pawn on d4. And for example, now if bishop to d3, black will continue to develop his game with queen d6, and after a move like castle kingside, black will always be alert to the possibility of an exchange sacrifice on f3, completely destroying white's structure. And after gf3, slowly building up the position with moves like bishop d7, rook to f8, maybe again bishop e8, bishop g6. These are nightmare positions to have to play as white. So far, I'm pretty happy with black's position in the bishop d2 line of the Winawer, and this update that I did to my files only seems to to reinforce this notion. So even though this is a line that I was attached to as white for quite a while, I really don't think that white is able to justify the lag in his development. So anyway, this was my little update on the Winawer bishop d2 sideline, as well as my take on this classical game between Alekhine and Nimzowitsch. So thanks for listening. This has been Grandmaster Robert Hungaski for chesslecture.com.